Hello, dear friends. I'm sorry, due to certain technical difficulties, we could start late. One of our guests somehow has been so far unable to connect, and we were waiting for her. But I hope that our guest would be joining us soon, so we would be starting without her, but hoping that she would join in between. So, welcome to this special episode of Ganga Jamni and Asha joint series on the medieval history of India and our shared past. I choose to challenge the gender inequalities. Today, I take the following pledge. I choose to strive for a gender equal world by challenging its stereotypes and celebrate women's achievements. I would love to engage in more deliberate discussions about women and would openly celebrate women that I admire. We meet today to celebrate the Women's Day. The general theme for our program today is recovering women's agency in early modern households. To elaborate on this theme, we are hoping to have Dr. Seher Khwaja, who would be joining us shortly, and Dr. Priyanka Khanna. Professor Farhat Hassan would moderate these talks and provide gravitas to the discussions. Dr. Seher Khwaja would be speaking about imagining Mughal imperial household as a political space, whereas Dr. Priyanka Khanna would be speaking on marriage and concubinage in Rajput households. But before we start, let me acknowledge the co-host of these lecture series, Ms. Shagufta Siddhi of Ganga Jamni Heritage Group, who has been facilitating these programs since the last 6 months. Shagufta Siddhi is an academic, educator, and freelance workshop leader who studied from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi. She has worked in the fields of journalism, tourism, school education, etc. She has written widely on issues like history and curriculum development. She has also helped set up an in-house museum for one of India's leading schools. She initiated the group Ganga Jamni Foundation for the purpose of promoting cross-cultural understanding and tangible and intangible heritage of the subcontinent. We have been using her services, as I said, for the last 6 months so successfully. Shagufta has served as a Nehru Trust India Fellow, winning the Small Study and Research Grant, and also Norma Jean Calderwood Curatorial Fellowship at Harvard University Art Museum. She has been a research assistant to some of the uh, top art historians in the field. She started her career as an intern at Freer Sackler Galleries at the Smithsonian Institute, Washington, D.C. Now, coming to Professor Farhat Hassan, he needs no introduction. We have had him before on our program. I would only say this regarding him, that he was the Deputy Director of the Center of Women's Studies at AMU for a number of years and has also academically contributed to the theme. He is also an active member of the ASHA. Dr. Seher Khwaja has been awarded her doctorate from the University of Delhi. She has specialized in gender history. Her PhD thesis was on imperial women and Mughal court culture, exploring women's agencies in North India circa 1690 to 1840. Her research interest on imperial households has gravitated her towards a deeper understanding of imperial mothers that allowed her to uncover new meanings of sexuality, motherhood, and fosterage in early modern Islamic world. She has a number of publications to her credit, including a paper which is entitled "Fosterage and Motherhood in Mughal Harem: Intimate Relations and Political Systems in the 18th Century India," which was published in the Social Scientist in 2018. She has also presented a number of other papers at various conferences. As far as our other guest, Dr. Priyanka Khanna, is concerned, she is working as an assistant professor in the of history at GD Goenka University at Gurgaon. She holds a PhD from the Center of Historical Studies, JNU. She specializes in the histories of women, gender, and early modern Rajasthan. Her doctorate thesis examined the status, roles, and lived experiences of women who had to live as the concubines of Rajput Maharajas in early modern Marwar. She has presented her work on several platforms, including the University of Texas, NTU Singapore, and University of Zurich, and has parts of her works printed in journals such as Studies in History and in other such publications. Dr. Khanna is currently working on her first book monograph, which is an updated version of her doctoral thesis. I welcome all of you on board, Professor Farhat Hasan, Seher Khwaja, and Priyanka Khanna. I would invite Shagufta Siddhi to please invite little briefly Dr. Farhat Hasan and others, and ask Farhat Hasan to initiate the program.
Adab, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this very special, and thank you, the audience. You're already here. I see you in big numbers. Thank you, and hope you will participate and ask us lots of questions because we have young academics and also somebody who is, I believe, going to add a lot of gravitas here. So welcome, Professor Farhat Hasan, and welcome you, ladies, young historians and academics, and today's discussion is going to be about women in history. You know, so what I found very interesting is it's about contemporary women writing about women in history. So who do we want to begin with, sir? And how do we go about this, Professor Hassan?
Well, I think Seher can start the discussion, and then Priyanka can, you know, be the next in line. Huh?
Awesome.
Is that good? I mean, yeah. So Seher, why don't you start then?
So before Seher starts, would you like to shed some light on women in history, or this entire group of group of people who were sort of marginalized for a long time?
Well, if you insist, I mean, okay, yeah. You see, the one of the okay. So let's set the stage for discussion. Uh, one of the important departures that has occurred in recent years in Mughal historiography has been in how we perceive the household, and that's one reason why Seher and Priyanka would be making an important intervention in how to imagine household and how to locate household in terms of the articulation of women's agency. Uh, Obviously, the imperial household, which we know as harem, has in much of the conventional historiography, as well as in popular films, Hollywood movies, been portrayed as a site of eros, as a site of excess, as a site of pleasure. Uh, the kind of departure that these young historians are seeking to make is an effort to reconfigure harem as a political space. And I think that's very important, because unless we make that departure, we will never be able to locate the agency of women. And that's the one important change that has taken place. And I think our young historians, including Seher and Priyanka, have made an important important departure in that field. This was obviously suggested initially by Ruby Lal and Lisa Balban Lila, but the work of Priyanka and Seher has taken the direction in this effort much further. The second, the second reason why the discussion today should be an important one is in problematizing the conventional division of public and private spaces. Often we tend to see family household as a private space, and because we see it as a private space, we also see it as an apolitical space, one which is bereft of any politics. Uh, Now, and the public space is the one which is imbued with politics and economics as well. There is always a gender division here. So the private space is the space of women, and the public space is the space of men. So in this kind of division of social experience, what you end up doing is to project women as apolitical, as also an economic liability. Now, what the work of these historians Seher and Priyanka suggests is that this is not the case. The European distinction between public and private don't actually quite apply to the early modern South Asia. The kind of dichotomies that worked in not just Mughal India but the early modern Islamic world is the one between outer and inner domain, Beirut and Andarun. But the important, interesting thing is that access to political authority is directly proportional to the inner domains. So the more you get into the inner domain, the more powerful you tended to become politically. So there's an inversion of these stereotypes that you notice here. I think these could be some of the starting points for discussion. Uh, Seher, why don't you start now?
Brilliant. So, just for those of you who joined us a little late, I want to introduce Seher's work that we will be talking about today. And also, after Seher Khwaja's talk, we will have Dr. Priyanka Khanna, who will also be talking about, she is going to talk about the women who lived as the concubines of Rajput Maharajas in early modern Marwar. But about Seher Khwaja, Dr. Seher Khwaja's paper, it basically is about the 18th century Mughal India that witnessed foreign attacks, as we all know, internal rebellions, and there was a lot of factional, acrimonious factional politics that was going on at the court. Now, it is in this period that Dr. Khwaja culls out the agency of queen mothers, and so she has worked on how the queen mothers deployed beyond their traditional roles of simply mothering to adopt a radically more direct and visible role in the political arena. So let's welcome Dr. Khwaja, who's going to be talking about the queen mothers at the Mughal court, 18th century. Good evening. Dr. Khwaja, can you hear us?
Right. Good evening. Should I start now?
Please do.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So thank you so much for having me here. I feel very honored and a little scared because I'm amidst a lot of well-read, learned people. I almost feel scared following Bharat sir's introduction, but it was a perfect introduction to my paper because I speak on similar lines. My paper is entitled entitled "Re-articulating Mughal Household as a Political Space: Exploring the Agency of Queen Mothers in the 18th Century India." From the earliest contact with the Muslim world, outsiders have expressed great deal of fascination with the woman behind the parda. Parda for the early Mughal women who rode horsebacks, participated in mixed gatherings, traveled with their husbands and sons, did not necessarily mean strict seclusion. By the time Abul Fazl wrote Ain-e Akbari, the imperial household was institutionalized as an imperial harem, a designated space for honoring and seclusion of royal women who are henceforth declared to be Pardagayan or the veiled ones. As the idea of imperial honor became inextricably tied to the idea of chastity of imperial women, the public visibility of imperial women became zealously guarded. The more exalted were the kings, the higher were the walls of the harem, and subsequently higher was the curiosity of the people to know what went on behind those walls. The inaccessibility to the inner workings of the imperial harem or the imperial household produced poor understanding of the Mughal culture and comportment that not only accepted but also supported the political activities and agency of imperial women, well beyond the boundaries of an imperial harem. However, Mughal women's access to political power is often attributed to the emperor's weakness and seen as a forewarning of anarchy, chaos, and moral decay. On the other hand, her portrayal of a passive, inert being in attendance of a cruel, despotic king with an insatiable sexual desire has been all too eagerly adopted, not just by Western audiences, but also amongst Indians. In the minds of many, even today, Mughal household has been caricatured as a refuge to an exhausted king seeking distraction and pleasure away from the world of politics and war through activities of dining, feasting, amusement, and sexual relations. This is limited. This is limited understanding of the imperial household as a merely social and sexual site comes from a mindless assimilation of inaccuracies and fantasies of Europeans who struggle to understand the nature of the imperial household so completely alien and largely inaccessible to them. The woman behind the parda within a Mughal household is seen through bifurcated lens that either views them as victims or as viragos who usurp the political role and dominion of male rulers. This matches the conventional feminist historiography of women who have a tendency to see women either in conformity or in collusion with patriarchy. Female autonomy and public visibility, according to this view, can only be understood as a pushback to patriarchal domination. I argue that this paradigm of Western feminist scholarship is not relevant to the study of non-Western imperial households, especially that of the Mughals. Even a cursory reading of the contemporary sources of Mughal India can delineate generations of culturally accommodated independent imperial women who shaped their lives and actions more in partnership than in resistance to the patrimonial dominion of state. They rode into battles with their men. They issued farmans, minted coins in their names, built stunning monuments, engaged in diplomacy, wrote biographies, and patronized art. As is evident, the state in turn reserved a privileged space for imperial women within and beyond the walls of the Mughal harem, where female autonomy could thrive not just to promote and protect state power, but also to meet their individual needs and ambitions. In a way, Mughal state and Mughal women drew life energy from one another in a shared negotiated space where the interests of both men and women coexisted and conformed to one another more often than imagined. In today's presentation, I argue that this interdependence between state and imperial women not just continued but was also further consolidated in the tumultuous period of the 18th century. With the shrinking of the Mughal territorial power, abatement of central authority, and emergence of a variety of autonomous political entities in the 18th century, the very ideological and political edifice of Mughal sovereignty was shaken up. This naturally meant a shift in the relationship between the state and the imperial household, which was dynamic and always changing, as we have learned through the book, through Ruby Lal's work. This new phase continued to witness women.
Everything okay?
Sorry, let me just put this on mute.
Sure.
So, this new phase continued to witness women of imperial harem. This new phase continued to witness women of the imperial harem rise to prominence, extending their power and influence beyond the presence of the Mughal household. However, the character and the composition of the agency of imperial women had changed notably. There were two noticeable changes as acknowledged by historians and contemporary observers. First, that the agency of imperial women became more pronounced and visible in the with a far greater assertion of authority and influence than witnessed in the preceding years. And second was the upsurge in the number of women of low birth, who for the first time in the history of imperial household could almost instantaneously cover the distance from between anonymity to being the prime lady of the Mughal harem on the basis of the king's favor. The best example of both these phenomena is Uttambai, a public dancing girl married to Muhammad Shah, who was catapulted to the political center stage during the reign of her son Ahmad Shah. She is known to have asserted a control over court matters in such an aggressive way that her dairy or her porch was turned into a makeshift court of Mughal affairs, where she daily met nobles, of course, from behind the screen, saw petitions, and passed orders which were final. It is well established by historians that the last centuries of Mughal Empire, in terms of power and crisis, was experienced disproportionately by both imperial men and imperial women. While the failures of once projected infallible Mughal king became apparent through reverses in battlefield, abatement of power at court, the continual agency of imperial women, on the other hand, knew new bounds. As potent symbols of power and legitimacy, they began to push boundaries of the traditional rights and roles to adopt a more autonomous, aggressive, and visible form. However, the integrality of imperial women's agency in public political front is often negatively seen as meddling in state matters, which, if not a cause, was surely a sign of dissipation and abatement of state power. I argue instead that the greater autonomy of female power in later centuries of the Mughal Empire was neither an obstacle nor dissipation of Mughal sovereignty. Instead, it was to bolster and strengthen the loosening hold of the Mughal sovereignty. To support my argument, I draw attention to a third and perhaps the most neglected important phenomena of the 18th century, that is, the institutionalization of the agency of Queen Mother, mother of the reigning monarch. Imperial mothers traditionally had always enjoyed the position of great deference and influence. But during the Mughal period of political and psychological uncertainties of the 18th century, the matriarch authority became more formally recognized and institutionally visible than it ever had been. Young princes spending their early formative years under their care and commanding little military or charismatic validation to secure the throne on their own made them completely reliant on their mothers. On the other hand, the political career of these women started only after their sons were chosen for kingship, making them, and only then, the special, pure, and powerful queen mothers. Before the actual question of succession even came up, imperial mothers were charged with the duty and concern of preparing sons as a suitable contender for power. Princes of this period lived a life of neglect and depravity. Their formative years, crucial for learning the art of rulership, training, and network building, were irretrievably wasted in semi-confinement. Responsibilities at this stage were not limited merely to reproducing a male heir, but went beyond to the entail of responsibility of keeping them alive, protecting them from all possible threats, and training them in preparation for a possible kingship. With the same concerns in mind, Queen Mother Zeenat Mahal, mother of the future King Shah Alam, sent her son to the care and training of Hidayat Ali Khan, a great nobleman of the time. The author of Siyar al-Mutakhirin, Ghulam Hussain Khan, who also was the son of Hidayat Ali Khan, recounts how Queen Mother's request of guardianship for her son was accompanied with such solemn oaths and tearful pleas that his mother was moved to pledge his fidelity to the young prince for life. At a time when political frailties of the Mughal emperor were on clear display, the Queen Mothers had busied themselves in the important role in building networks of support for their sons. Since in most cases royal princes had no obvious claim to the throne as the system of open succession prevailed, they relied greatly on the machinations of their ambitious mothers to procure it. Imperial mothers too had their vital interest in the accession of their son. When a prince was chosen to be the king, with or without his mother's aid, his mother was immediately rewarded materially and socially, eventually being promoted to a position of innate purity and wisdom and unchallengeable authority. Queen Mother, with an unquestionable predictability of her loyalty, at a time when allegiance were kaleidoscopically fluid, made her a safe choice for the emperor to trust her with such powers. Thus, the imperial son and mother each gained status from one another. As it turned out, the emperor wasn't very wrong in heightening the potency of the agency of Queen Mother. The Queen Mother's unique position as the most powerful entity after her own son rendered to her pretentious agency of peacemaking during her son's reign. Conciliatory role of Queen Mothers was one of the greatest value during the 18th century when mutual suspicion and ill will which prevailed upon the Mughal court politics constantly threatened to widen the gap between monarchy and its nobility. There are plenty of examples of Queen Mothers acting as ambassadors of peace, dispelling the dangers of disunity, and evading open battles to give a new lease to the reign of their son. Her promises and petitions to errant nobles were impactful and almost always yielded desired results. One of the best examples of this comes from the reign of Ahmad Shah. During the rulership of Ahmad Shah, his mother Uddam Bai and her eunuch Javed Khan had appropriate significant hold on the Mughal court affairs. This hindered the office of the Wazir Safdarjung. The enmity between the two, which is Safdarjung and Javed Khan, rose to such an extent that eventually Safdarjung had Javed Khan murdered. This caused deep lamentation to the Queen Mother, who is said to have adorned white clothes in memory of her beloved eunuch, while Safdarjung, fearing retaliation, refused to attend court. An aggrieved Queen Mother on the one hand and an absentee Wazir gave way to rumors of an impending rebellion. At this stage, the Queen Mother acted wisely and decided to pay a visit to bring back the Wazir back to the court. Even though she raged in secret, she put the interest of the continuity of the dynasty before her and played out her peace-making agency ably, bringing both cohesion and stability to the empire when it seemed dangerously threatened. Therefore, the role of Queen Mothers was important in not just initiating the rule of her son, but also in ensuring its smooth survival. However, dynastic tensions of perpetually competing powers between the monarchy and nobility proved to be a perpetual hindrance to the smooth survival of the kingship. This endemic problem, one that threatened the imperial family's integrity and influence, was addressed by Queen Mothers with great seriousness, who resorted to far more direct intervention in order to curb it. The best example of this is of Queen Mother Qudsiya Fakhrunisa Begum, mother of Muhammad Shah, who orchestrated the opposition and deposition of the strong and fierce Sayyid brothers, who she considered as robbing her son of his sovereign rights. The Queen Mother by the 18th century had become not only an essential imperial figure at the Mughal court, but also an institutionalized channel of Mughal politics. Some instances, although few, highlights how the seat of the Queen Mother had come to represent as a seat of power in its own right, acting at times in defiance or in variance with their own monarch's son. This is displayed during the years of exile of Emperor Shah Alam II after his defeat in the Battle of Buxar. The years that followed were spent by the Mughal emperor living in Allahabad fort under the protection of the British. Najib-ud-Dawla became the ruler of Delhi, providing protection to the Queen Mother Zeenat Mahal and the heir apparent, who held the fort of Delhi in the name of the emperor. During the 9 years that the Red Fort remained without a Mughal emperor, the Queen Mother Zeenat Mahal wrote several letters to her son in exile, asking him to take action and rescue the honor of the imperial name. So elevated was her standing that she was allowed to even criticize or rebuke the emperor, under the obligation to advise and guide him. In one of the letters where she urges the emperor to assemble and do something is very fascinating. However, when the Mughal emperor, with the help of Maratha force, finally did reach the Delhi fort in 1772, an unexpected resistance from the Queen Mother occurred. She ordered the Kiladar to seal the fort gates and refused to open it to the Maratha forces. Bearing in mind the uncertainties that lay before her in the hands of the faithless Marathas, perhaps she felt safer under the protection of Najib-ud-Dawla and his family, who had treated her and her family only with due respect and honor. Faced with Queen Mother's firm decision to defend the fort, the Marathas were forced to bombard it. The bombardment lasted for 2 days until they finally were able to breach the fort walls. Although the difference in opinion between the emperor and his mother here was only of who each considered trustworthy, and the resistance that followed was of a mild 2-day protest, nonetheless, this incident is significant in delineating the individuality of Queen Mother's agency, which was independent of emperor's wishes and orders. As the seat of motherhood, Queen Motherhood increasingly became an institutionalized channel of politics. All imperial mothers longed to see themselves at that position. It was not simply the desire for power that came with the coveted agency of Queen Mother, but it was also the fear of falling out of power under the influence of the rival mother's son's rise to power. In this sense, a, 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 a competition ensued between all imperial mothers to reach at the seat of Queen Mother. This is detectable through the example of two competing matriarchs during the reign of Ahmad Shah. One was his birth mother Uddambai, a former dancing girl, and the other was foster mother Malika-e-Zamani. Both pledged allegiance to their royal son in support of his political aspirations and fought bitterly on the peripheral matters at the Mughal court. However, after Ahmad Shah came to power, he chose the patriarchal agency of his birth mother Uddambai over his foster mother, giving a great boost to her political career at the cost of his foster mother, who faced deliberate trimming of powers. Ahmad Shah's preference of his birth mother, regardless of her political and social frailties, and more importantly, because of despite the presence of an alternative matriarchal agency kindled through fosterage, was primarily due to the relatively greater predictability of his birth mother's loyalty. In addition to the dependability of unalterable natal ties, humble beginnings of Uddambai were also another affirmation to her commitment towards her royal patron. Belonging to a socially inferior background, she relied wholly and solely on the emperor for her social and political advancements and was predictably bound to the fate of her royal patron. Accordingly, her political utility increased manifold. Knowing that her resources would at all times be invested in the well-being of her royal patron. Furthermore, a low-born woman did not carry with her either the political aspirations of the family of aristocratic women or a woman of local elite might entertain as a result of alliance with the dynasty or the political leverage that might attempt to exert. In contrast, Ahmad Shah's foster mother, Malika-e-Zamani, belonged to an impressive line of descent, drawing both lineage and ardent support from her maternal grandfather, who was already holding office to one of the most important posts at the Mughal court, that is of Mir Bakshi. The fear of losing power or worse still the throne altogether on account of a dominating noble was by now an imaginable threat and often a closely witnessed reality of the Mughal rulers of the time. Therefore, all the dynamics at play in the psychologically unpredictable life of Ahmad Shah at a time of waning Mughal sovereignty invested with multitude strains of factional politics led to his greater dependence on and consequential empowerment of his birth mother Uddambai vis-a-vis his foster mother. In the end, I hastily sum up here. The 18th century of the Mughal rulers was not only a period of political diffidence, but also of political skepticism characteristic to a political milieu of shifting and unreliable alliances. In such a milieu, it is the agency of the Queen Mother which stood out as a reliable source of loyalty and dependability for the Mughal ruler. Accordingly, in this period, imperial women in their prescribed role as mothers enjoyed greater freedom and space for articulation of their agency. Furthermore, an interdependent relationship is detectable between the imperial mother and the imperial son. While during this period of political and psychological uncertainty, princes relied heavily on the machinations of their ambitious mothers for accession to power. On the other hand, The institution and incorporation of the matriarchal agency of these women was only possible if their son was chosen to be the king, particularly if she could secure his accession against the claims of his dynastic rivals. The reliance on matriarchal agency lasted even during the ruler's years of kingship, which were often dominated with intrigues, betrayal, and deception of boisterous nobles. In this respect, over the course of the 18th and the early 19th century, the agency of the queen mothers was gradually assimilated beyond the older traditions of the reproductive duties of producing an heir to the Mughal Empire. Their duty was now towards their son, entailing keeping alive, protecting from rival claims and threats, mobilizing network of support, strengthening their claim to the Mughal throne, and ensuring longevity and unchallenged years of kingship once they reached that throne.
I believe we've lost the connection to Dr. Khwaja's. Yeah, so perhaps Professor Farhat Hassan, could you share with us what the paper was about? Because there was a lot of technical glitch.
Right. uh, you see, okay. Um, you see, uh, Irwin summarized the Oriental perception of the harem when he referred to the later Mughals, when he held the later Mughals responsible for the decline of the Mughal Empire, and accused them of falling for beauty and forgetting their duty. So the typical Oriental perception about the harem was to view it as a site of eros, as a site of pleasure, as an evidence of the degenerate nature of Asian men. So it actually served to perpetuate the trope of the white man's burden. Asian men, Indian men, were basically perverted by nature, given to the life of pleasure and excess, and therefore unworthy to self-rule, and therefore they needed the civilizing hand of the British rulers to become decent human beings. So this is why you have this perpetual myth of the harem as given to excess, and this is not typical to the Mughals. The Ottoman historiography, the Safavid historiography is pretty much the same, and the typical impression is that these men have a history of being cruel, degenerate, and insensitive to to women's. Uh, Unfortunately, even the Indian historians, and I have in particular in mind someone like K.S. Lal, who wrote this very thick book called The Mughal Harem, uh, described the harem as a site of pleasure, as a site of access, as a site of male pleasure, and portrayed the women as hapless victims to male fantasies. Uh, Now, the the kind of move that historians like Seher and before her, Ruby Lal and Balban Lizal were making is to suggest that we need to reconfigure the harem as a political space. And this means three things. One is that we need to look at the imperial court in terms of its entangled relations with the harem, so that both the harem and the court were entangled categories. Don't see them as separate categories. See them as entangled categories, mutually constituting each other. Just as much as the imperial court shaped the nature of the harem shaped the nature of the imperial court as well. So that we cannot actually discuss issues of state formation. We cannot actually discuss issues of imperial sovereignty, even issues concerning the theories of sovereignty, without looking at the harem as a political space. Now, once you look at the harem as a political space, you need to bring in this issue of women's agency. Particularly, Seher is focused on the agency of imperial women, and the role that these imperial women played in shaping the political culture in the 18th century. Now, the significant intervention that Seher makes here is to highlight the role of motherhood, the institution of the mother in shaping the political culture in later Mughal Empire. Now, this is very important because we tend to see motherhood as as lying in the realm of intimate
Right.
relationship. Now, here is an argument which suggests that motherhood was also equally a political category. And the intimate relationships that developed out of motherhood, not just natal motherhood, but also, adopted motherhood, uh, serve to create a kind of a political culture in Mughal India. The point here is that she's trying to make then is that realms of emotions, realms of intimacy were also realms of political activities.
All
uh,
right.
I think
Okay,
this best summarizes her
this is
argument. Okay.
pretty much yes. So I
Mm.
see her here. Maybe she can add the closing comments and bring Dr. Khwaja on.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that.
That's all right. So can we just conclude what you were talking about um, when we last ended?
Yeah, I was talking about the interdependent relationship which was detectable between imperial mothers and imperial son, and there was this complete reliance on each other's agency. That it was only through the machinations of the imperial mothers that the Mughal princes could see themselves to the Mughal throne, and it was only after their sons reached reached the seat of power that they could attain the agency of motherhood. Um, Also, what is detectable is that in this politically unstable period, the uh, the 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 ties of the blood or the blood relationships were considered more stringent and more reliable as compared to foster motherhood, which is in contrast to slightly in contrast to the concept of Mughal fosterage, which resides great power and deference to a foster mother, almost at par with the birth mother. And yeah, that's about it, I guess.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Khwaja. And thank you, Professor Hassan, for summing this up. Let's bring on board Dr. Priyanka Khanna. And here she is. Hi, good evening. Dr. Priyanka Khanna, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Hi, good
Hi.
evening. Sorry for that. Just give me a minute to put my slides on screen.
Sure. But before that, let me share your topic with
Sure.
everyone. So, you're going to be talking about the section of women who lived as the concubines of the Rajput Maharajas in early modern Marwar. So, we're going to be talking about Marwar, Jodhpur, and we're going to be talking about the concubines, and you have used a lot of unheard of, unknown, or unresearched or under researched local sources. And you will be talking about the agency of this female group that has remained largely unnoticed. So, thank you so much. And yes, please do share your slides.
Visible?
Yes.
Okay. So it is a great honor to be invited to speak on this wide-reaching platform by Asha and Ganga Jamni Heritage. Thank you, Professor Hassan, Professor Rizavi, and Shuk Gupta for inviting me to speak, especially on this symbolic day. What I wish to do today and seems pertinent on this day is to attempt at correcting some popular and haste assumptions about women by discussing some facets of my work. So, my work is centered on women who had to live as the concubines of Rajput Maharajas in early modern Marwar in western Rajasthan between the 16th to the 19th centuries. I use the term concubine for women who were in a conjugally oriented relationship with a man without the legal sanctions of marriage. Through this work, I attempt to bring to light the status, roles, and the lived experiences of these women who have remained on the margins of our historical knowledge. Having said that, in the last 2 to 3 decades, as Professor Hassan mentioned, there has been a progressive shift in the historical inquiries on women, yet they still remain on the sidelines of our knowledge. Much of this owes to the fact that most of the documentary material in the past was penned by men who chose to give primacy to their own sex and therefore The focus of written histories has revolved around his stories, the stories of men, their exploits, and their roles. But in this male dominant narrative, the lives and actions of other women and other sexes have largely been overshadowed. Such neglect is more glaring when it comes to the non elite or the other women who hailed from non ruling, secondary, or inferior communities. There are at least two broad reasons that I can think of for this neglect. First is the problem of the sources, which usually provide fragmentary evidences about such women, and perhaps therefore we do not have substantial and exhaustive works on the non elite females. Second is perhaps an assumption about the non availability of sources on women. I state the latter based on my personal experience because when I began my research, which is inspired by the works of Varsha Joshi and Ramya Srinivasan on the women of Rajasthan, I initially kept a broad purview to include all groups of non elite females, including the entertainers, the handmaids, and the concubine. For I found only small sections on these women in the existing literature, which remarkably recovers their position in the court and the household, but has minimal engagement with the women themselves, their roles, their stories, and their actions, which somewhere made me believe that I would not get enough material for such a work. However, to my surprise, and a happy one at that, I found, I would say, sufficient materials not readily available and, of course, with several gaps. Yet, even with the silences and evasions, the archive was so rich in revealing about these other women that I decided to focus primarily on the concubines, as no other section has been surrounded by the kind of hesitance and conjectures that surround the concubines. So without further ado, I will now begin with my findings on the concubines. The idea is to provide a broad overview of my work, which would, I am hoping, help us understand the complexities of the position, roles, and agency of these women. Before I do that, a word on my sources. My study is based on a range of local Marwari sources ranging between the 16th and the 19th centuries, and the primary ones include the Bahis, which are the account registers of individual concubines, as also of the Rajput state, the Khyats, which are the Rajput court chronicles, the Chithyas, which were written by concubines to their masters, and some visual sources, including the buildings and paintings from Marwar. Now, a word about the place of the study. My study is located in Marwar, which is situated in southwestern Rajasthan in northwestern India. Marwar was ruled by the Rathore clan of Rajputs from the capital at Jodhpur. In 1459, the leader of the clan, Rao Jodha, laid the foundation of a fort in Jodhpur, which became the nucleus of the Rathore clan power and came to be known by different names such as Chintamani, Mayur Dhwaj, and most popularly as Mehrangarh, indicating the fort of the sun, a reference to the clan's mythical descent from the sun god Surya. So with the settlement of the ruling family at its fort, women were allocated a specific space that was designated as the Zanana or the Zanani Dewari. The name derives from the colloquial term for women, that is Zanani, while Dewari means a gate. Together, the two terms, Zanani Dewari, signified the boundary of the women's space within the larger Rajput fort. The Zanana received great attention from all the Rathore rulers, and most of them built new quarters for their set of women. Such were the additions that by the 19th century, with about 70 new apartments added by Maharaja Man Singh, the Rathore Zanana came to occupy 2/3 of the entire fort premises. But the huge space was concomitant with the increasing number of women that were incorporated in the Rathore house over the years, displaying the rising strength of the Rajput ruler and his household. The large entourage of women included the group of aristocrats, that is the mother, sister, and relatives of the ruler and his multiple ranis or the wives, and a rather large number of non-elite or non-royal Rajput women who occupied secondary positions as dowries or handmaids, gayans or singers, nirtakis or dancers, and the concubines of the ruler. In the ruling Rajput households, the concubines of the rulers were titled and known as Paswan and Pardayat. They were publicly declared intimate partners of the ruler, but their position remained outside the marital framework because these women hailed from relatively inferior communities, and for ruling Rajputs, marriages were predominantly tied to networking and preservation of the ruling Rajput lineages. in the Rajput households, once a woman received the position of a concubine, it was permanent with no chance for getting legal sanctions of marriage or acquittal from this status. Women who went on to become the concubines had little choice in entering such relationships, since records tell us that most of them had either been acquired by force or as war booties, as gifts, or were purchased for the services of the royal house. Majority of the concubines were very young, mostly minor, when they entered the ruling house. At the ruling house, most of them began their journey either as attendants or were trained as entertainers, and those who caught the attention of the ruler were then raised to the position of his concubine. Now, there's a popular perception that women were initiated as concubines to fulfill the sexual desires of elite men. Sex was, however, just one of the reasons for initiating concubines, at least in the ruling Rathod household, for sexual intimacy often precluded the initiation of women as concubines, evident in the fact that many of them had given birth to one or more children with the king much before they were taken as a concubine. Children from concubines were definitely important for the king because they stood as a loyal force which was also utilized in building relationships with other power holders. But childbirth again was not the criteria to choose a concubine because A, not all women who were chosen as concubines became mothers, and B, unlike the households of Mughals, Ottomans or the Chinese, the sons of concubines in the Rajput households were not contestants to the throne because they were disenfranchised from such rights forever reserved for the royal family as it was, the ruling family as it was. One therefore notes that factors such as companionship and emotional inclination were often the reasons for taking of women as concubines. This was a natural result of the structure of marriages, which were largely premised on political alliances and therefore often led to the development of intimacy outside the marital framework. But most rulers had numerous concubines, some like Man Singh and Takhat Singh with about 40 concubines, aside from their numerous ranis. And in such cases, emotions, of course, could not have led to the initiation of each concubine, most of whom were merely initiated to display patriarchal control over women and by extension over the communities to which they belonged, for women have long stood as markers of community identity. So once a ruler decided to take a woman as his concubine, her position was officially declared in an initiation ceremony. At this ceremony, a concubine received the official title of a Pardayat or the higher rank of a Paswan, which depended upon her closeness shared with the ruler. She was provided a set of insignias to mark her elevated position as a partner of the ruler. These included a chura or ivory bangles, which denoted her conjugal engagement or reservation, the right to wear gold on the feet as a marker of her relative elevation from other subordinates, and a right to maintain personal servants for her day-to-day household work. A part of the process of refashioning their identity was the practice of giving new names to the concubines. These given names mostly emphasized on the physical attributes or proficiency of these women. Examples include Sundar, meaning beautiful, Naini, beautiful eyes, Gulab, akin to a rose, Chatur, meaning clever, Chanchal, indicating playful, and so on. Giving these new names to concubines helped the state in weaving the identity of these women around their master, which is often the case when women are expected to take the surnames of their husbands, and distance them from memories of their kin base. Although the Rajput state itself did not really delink its association with the families of those concubines who were drawn from the local communities, and concubinage was often used as a medium of alliance with the local households through the classic form of transaction of women. Commoners found it appeasing to send their women to the royal household because that brought for them finances and connections with royalty. In fact, even for concubines, the financial elevation that the position brought with it was a crucial prerogative. At the ruling Rathod household, concubines, just as the other elite women of the Zanana, received jagirs or lands for their hearth kharch or day-to-day expenses, which brought for these women relative autonomy when it came to their finances. Now, given the restrictions of the Zanana and Parda, one would believe that such rights of women were limited to receiving their shares of landed revenues. But when one looks at their bahis or the land registers, one is happily surprised to notice that many women were actively involved with the affairs of their landed resources. The registers show that all female Jagirdars took upon roles of an employer and paymaster for the staff of their Jagirs. Some went ahead and established personal and professional connections with landed agents such as zamindars and merchants, who in turn helped them in the disbursement of their landed produce. A few were even successful in increasing their estimated revenues by exercising the role of banks, providing loans and earning interest from the inhabitants of their lands. Moreover, when faced with crunches, some women did not shy from voicing their financial concerns to their ruler. For example, in the displayed arzi or request note, seemingly composed in a hurry or perhaps fury by Pardayat Roop Jodh for a ruler Man Singh, she wrote, and I quote, "Respected master, accept greetings from your servant concubine. Today I received my revenue share from the crops of my village Sonagra, which amounted to 1500 rupees. And with that as the limit for my expenses, my financial position is dwindling and several expenses are at stake. Others have large villages, so they can subsist on the earnings from the crops. Otherwise, dear master, you are also well aware that from the crop revenue, I cannot even buy food grains, leave apart any gold or precious items." Quote closed. Now, letters such as these are exceptional sources which reveal that even while participating in the larger idioms of hierarchies, women were both conscious and concerned about their own finances, and they also kept an eye on the economic status of other women. Concubines, in fact, took up the act of lettering to not just seek financial redressals, but many of them composed letters to express their intimate feelings to their ruler and sometimes to even share information or gossips about the everyday happenings within the Zanana. For example, in a letter by concubine Mirgjot written to her ruler Man Singh, she provides a detailed account on the ongoing tension amongst the female inmates to acquire desired rooms in the Zanana. An excerpt from the letter reads as, and I quote, "Dear master, escorted by the head servant of the Zanana, Tija Bhatiani Rani, Choti Bhatiani Rani, Devri Rani, and Choti Devri Rani have returned from their pilgrim journey. The Queen Mother called all Zanana inhabitants to her court and inquired about the room on the upper floor, upon which Pardayat Panrai asked Pardayat Paramsukh to vacate the room on the upper floor, stating that she had no use of the window. Paramsukh retaliated by saying that she has children and Panrai should maintain her respect by staying on the ground floor, and then tore her papers." Quote closed. Now, such letters, while bringing to life the intra-Zanana experiences which have long been conjectured and the agency of women in transmissions of these, also help to move beyond the image of an elite household limited to the lives of royalty alone, as non-elite agents seem to have equally negotiated and exercised their rights for status in a space that was as much composed by them as by the ruling lineages. Now, as this letter pointed, women, including the concubines, despite the restrictions on their free movement in the Rajput household, found opportunities to travel outside the house and engaged in social activities such as by undertaking religious pilgrimages and organizing of feasts and ceremonies on occasions of birthdays, marriages, and death of members associated with the royal house. Women also often organize women-centric social events such as the Ratri Jagran within the Zanana, providing them with a medium of leisure and a night for female socialization. The space of the Zanana was in fact equally capable of giving rise to female friendships as to frictions. And we have the joint letters of concubines and the anthology of poems composed by a concubine named Tulachrai and her master's Queen Bhatiani Pratap as fine examples of shared emotions of female friendship. Through activities such as these, women also emerge as the leading members in shaping the cultural sphere of the Rajput state. Many of them also played a significant role in shaping the landscape of the Rathore capital. for one of the most prolific action performed by not just the queens but also concubines who had relatively larger jagirs was establishing of buildings in the capital city. Women primarily sponsored philanthropic structures such as temples and water resources, the latter particularly significant given the arid conditions of Rajasthan. I've been able to identify about 7 water resources that were sponsored by the concubines in Jodhpur. These include, among others, the talab or the pond located at the Badi Ghati and the huge lake named as Gulab Sagar and its adjunct Krishna Kund tank, which are located in the vicinity of the royal fort. Gulab Sagar is in fact one of the largest water resource of the city, which was sponsored in the late 18th century by Gulab Rai, the beloved concubine of Maharaja Vijay Singh. In the same period, Gulab also built one of the most splendid temples of the city, named as the Kunj Bihari Temple, which is located in the heart of the city. The temple is a fine piece of architecture with striking frescoes that depict its patron Gulab with a ruler exhibiting devotion towards the state religion, which at the time was inclined towards Krishna Bhakti. The paintings, as one can see, are redolent with both political and emotional significance as they announce Gulab's proximate position in the life of the king and the kingdom's processes. As I have discussed elsewhere, Gulab had emerged as one of the most powerful women in 18th century Jodhpur. She had entered the Rathore house as a gift from a courtier, and like several other women, she began her career as a singer in the royal fort. But soon the ruler developed an affinity with her and she was raised to his. Gulab's ardent inclination towards the Vallabh Sampradaya, to which the ruler had himself formally initiated, was an important factor in cementing their intimacy that lasted throughout the 25 years of their association. Over the years, Gulab had earned a strong position in the kingdom, sitting strong as a personal and political confidant of the ruler. Such was their closeness that when Gulab's only son Tej Singh died an untimely death, her sadness prompted Vijay Singh to subvert the customary Rajput restriction on cross-class adoptions by allowing her to adopt one of his prince Sher Singh. This event disturbed many nobles who were further infuriated when the ruler supported Gulab's proposition to nominate Sher as his successor over this more senior heir Zalim Singh, who, as several sources tell us, was not capable enough to rule. However, the nobles of the kingdom disagreed with her decision and they despised the influence that a concubine had amassed. Consequently, a group of officials killed Gulab, and struck with grief, the ruler also died the very next year. Now, there are explicit narratives of not just Gulab's murder, but also of other influential concubines in the local court chronicles that justify these killings by portraying such women as figures of inversion. Well, these women belonged to a gender and jati that was deemed to remain inferior in the dominant patriarchal notion or structure. So their exercise of unwarranted power had to be met with punishment. And sadly, such marginalization of women in the intersectionality of gender, caste, and power has become more precarious in current times than ever before. But on a brighter side, despite all boundaries, concubines clearly had way more to their existence in the past than their popular imagination as passive sexual objects. Most of these women lived actively and many performed exemplary roles in the economic, social, political, and cultural processes of the state formation. Their existence was surely not limited to just having sex with the ruler. To finally sum up, I want to flag some, if not all, crucial issues around women in history writing. First, we need to rethink whether there is actually a paucity of sources on women or whether we just need a historical revision to recover the lives and agency of women who we have neglected so far. Scholars like Ruby Lal and Dr. Seher too have shown how even a rereading of dominant chronicles can bring to light the overshadowed histories of women. Second, we need to rethink our notion of elite households, for they were composed as much by the non-elites as the elites, and therefore the roles of the non-royals in the sustenance and functioning of the royal household needs to be addressed more vigorously. Third, we need to move beyond the myths of passivity about South Asian women. especially those from socially placed secondary communities, as they were not always docile, complacent, or voiceless. Having said that, it is important to remember that all women did not have similar trajectories of life even in the past. And for instance, if I come back to my work, not all concubines had access to similar extent of resources or shared the same level of intimacy with the ruler, and perhaps then lacked the willingness to perform certain actions or to even convey their emotions to their master. And many of them perhaps then remain invisible in records, while some appear only as numbers indicating the numerical strength of a ruler's zanana. And therefore, even though we are bound to work with certain classifications, we have to remind ourselves that women are not monolithic social categories, but individual humans, each with a unique attribute and a story of their own. Thank you, and a happy International Women's Day.
Thank you so much, Professor. So very much. I think I'm echoing because, all right. So before we open the floor for discussion, I have Professor Rizavi as well on board. Um, we have a number of questions, and Professor Rizavi will take them up. Um, actually, I should add this that when I was in Jodhpur, I was working at the Mehrangarh Museum for a while. I was able to look at so many of the Bahis, and when I went to Bikaner, because the Nagar Pracharni Sabha has so many of these Bahis. So I found this one subject very fascinating. In fact, there was this Nagar Banna at the museum, and he was very interested in this topic. So yeah, you reminded me of him. What a great man he was. Going to bring Professor Azabi on board. Welcome back, sir. So let's open questions, and if you have any comments,
I think Shagufta, let me first thank both the young scholars for their presentations. And let me request my friend Professor Farhat Hassan. He summed up what Seher said. So I think Priyanka also deserves your comments. Please go ahead. Tell us something about her topic. Then we will open the other questions.
No. Okay, if you insist. You see, when that's how I see Priyanka's intervention in this field of gender history. You see, when the revisionist historians like Ruby Lal or Lisa Balban Lilar began to explore the harem as a political space, the focus was exclusively on imperial women, so that the non-elite women were a category that had not been interrogated in historiography at all. And one of the misconceptions there was that we don't have the sources to do so. So I think Priyanka's intervention is not just historiographically significant, but she also opens up a new archive, one which helps us explore the political agency, the intimate lives, as also the the contribution to economic developments in the period. So I mean that's where I think she makes a real contribution. Secondly, I think it's also very important to understand that that this is not just unique to the early modern South Asia, but you also find a close comparison with the Ottoman Empire, because for a considerable period of time, even in the Ottoman state, uh, marriage was progressively replaced with concubinage. And the kind of emphasis or the kind of significance that concubines played in the Ottoman Empire in shaping the political culture, is something that we notice here in Rajput households as well. So I think that's a very important point that she's trying to make here, which is that let's not just focus on on Jahan Ara and Noor Jahan and so on and so forth, and let's go into these non-elite women and the kind of influence they exercised in shaping the political culture. I think let me just end, because I found the third point particularly interesting, which is that marriage was a political activity, and based on the network of political allegiances, and therefore for the fulfillment of love, for the exploration of intimacies, it was the concubines who played a far more engaging role in the Rajput households. Uh, Congratulations and thank you, Priyanka. That was excellent.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
I said, let us start having the questions. There are a number of questions which have been asked. So the first question, Shagufta, is by Mirza Hasnain. The famous Moroccan feminist Fatimi Marsini wrote an interesting Forgotten Coins of Islam, in which she discussed various Muslim coins that held considerable power. Can you suggest more such books? Possibly this question is for Leher. Farhat Hassan can take up any questions whenever he wants.
I'm not doing that. I'll leave this to the speakers. Yeah.
Leher, can you answer?
Ji. So there are many such books. Historically speaking, Rupila's book is is a very good read. It and Leslie Pierce's book on the Ottoman Empire is worth deserves attention. These are the two names that are coming to my mind right now, but I'm pretty sure there are a lot more. And yeah, I'm pretty sure. So these two for sure you must be reading. So you can add any more if you can think of.
No, I think you got it right. I mean, actually Fatima Marnisi is a very important historian. Do you want me to be speaking on her? And I think one of the points that she suggests, and one of the distinctions that she draws in terms of the construction of gender in Europe and the Islamic world is something that has not been attempted by any other feminist historian so far. And the point that she makes is that gender construction in the Islamic world is based on the presumption of excess. Whereas gender construction in the post-Enlightenment European world is based on the presumption of lack. And this is very important in shaping the social, shaping the differences in social patterns of development in Europe and Asia. You see, gender distinctions in Europe emerge from the idea of lack. That is to say, women lack rationality, and therefore they need men for control. And this is one reason why women in Europe were denied property rights, rights in rights of divorce, so on and so forth. You have a gender inequitable world in the Islamic world as well, but the gender hierarchies work in the Islamic world not under the presumption of lack, but under the presumption of excess. And the idea here is that women have excess of desire, and therefore they need men to be able to control desire. Now, this might seem to be a superficial difference, but this is actually very significant, because women are not seen as lacking rationality. They were given rights in property. Do you understand me? And so therefore, in the different trajectory of development in the Islamic world and Europe, Marnisi makes a very fine distinction. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Farhat Hassan. Thank you, Dr. Khwaja. Let us have the next question, please. राजेंद्र झा जी ने पूछा है, आचार्य चतुर्सेन का अध्याय गोली का सांस्कृतिक आधार क्या है? क्या सियरुल मुताखरीन किसी फ्रांसीसी कृति या अनुवाद से ताल्लुक रखता है? फरहत साहब, would you take up this question?
नहीं, मैं सैरुल मुताखरीन के बारे में कह सकता हूँ. सैरुल मुताखरीन जो है वो 18th सेंचुरी हिस्ट्री ऑफ बंगाल है, जो गुलाम हुसैन तबातबाई ने लिखी थी। सो इसका कोई ताल्लुक फ्रांसीसी कृति से नहीं है. It's a regional history of Bengal written in the 18th century by a very well-known Persian historian, Ghulam Hussain Tabatabai. Okay.
जी। और उसी तरह से जो आचार्य चतुर्सेन का उपन्यास है गोली, वो एक उपन्यास है, वो एक काल्पनिक उपन्यास है और साथ ही साथ उसका जो ताल्लुक है वो रजवाड़ों से है, राजस्थानी रजवाड़ों से है। और ये स्टोरी का मेरे ख्याल से जो इंस्पिरेशन है या उस स्टोरी का उनको प्रेरणा जो है शायद जो ओल्ड टेस्टामेंट की कहानी है डेविड और बातशीबा, जिसके अंदर डेविड ने उनके बातशीबा के हस्बैंड उराया को वॉर में भिजवा दिया था। तो उस कहानी से काफ़ी ज़्यादा प्रेरणा लेती है और उसका तो कोई संबंध नहीं रहा है और उसका सांस्कृतिक आधार यही है कि ऐसी कहानियाँ काल्पनिक हो सकती हैं और शायद उसमें थोड़ा-सा अंश किसी असली कहानी से या कोई असली हिस्टोरिकल या ऐतिहासिक किस्से से जुड़ा हो। लेकिन ये कहानी एकदम काल्पनिक है।
Well, thank you. So we have Dr. Professor Kamlesh Mohan. What was the nature of power and authority of the imperial women? Could they become de jure rulers or just backdoor manipulators? Seher?
So the power and authority of imperial women was multitude. It was of a different kind. They were both the backdoor manipulators and de jure rulers at times, depending on the changing socio-political environment. But more importantly, what is important to understand that the power and authority that we speak about imperial women varies from the power and authority that we speak about imperial men. So the female form of sovereignty varied from the male form of sovereignty, where and we have a tendency as readers to generalize the meaning of power, which meant the show of force, coercion, brute wars. Whereas there was a different form of power, which was the power to influence, to manipulate, uh, to overwhelm, to incite emotions, which was power. They could be legit vehicles of authority and power in the conventional sense as well as they could have the power of if I may say it, power of vulnerability, the power of showing emotion and getting their way around emotions. So yeah, so they could be backdoor manipulators through that, and as well de jure rulers as well.
Professor Farhat Hassan, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to suggest something to Kamlesh Mohan here. One is that I find this term backdoor manipulators very jarring and very inappropriate. First of all, I mean it's a very modern conception that looks at sovereignty, in insular terms. The way sovereignty worked in Mughal India was a very different, was very different from the way it works today. Sovereignty was a shared resource. And the point here that we are trying to make, not just me, but Priyanka and Seher as well, is that it's a shared resource and women also co-shared sovereignty with the other male claimants to authority. So don't think that there's just one sovereign and power is concentrated in the hands of the sovereign. That is never the case. We have a more dispersed understanding of sovereignty for the Mughal period, and within that nature of a dispersed uh, multivalent sovereignty, women figure in a very prominent manner. That's the argument we are trying to make.
And possibly, Farhat, you would correct me if I'm wrong, that during the classical Mughal period, I mean, the farmans, when they would be signed by the emperor, most of the time, at least from Jahangir's period and Shah Jahan's period, the imperials was in the hands of the some of the queens. Or, for example, under Shah Jahan, it was Jahanara Begum who was holding the imperial seal, and it was only after her acceptance that those documents would be given a final shape. So, I mean, I think that uh, without entering into this gender thing, there was a sort of a shared relationship. And Kamlesh Mohanji, let us not forget about the Sayyid brothers. I mean, the manipulators, they were the manipulators. I mean, as Farhat Hassan rightly said, that this term possibly should not be used in the context that it is being used here.
No, I just wanted to add something here. I mean, you see, I mean, these things were happening for sure. Noor Jahan carried perquisites of sovereignty, so did Jahara. But once we develop the framework where we look at harem and the imperial court as entangled categories, what we are arguing is a very different conception of the state. So, what we want you is to move away from a structural institutional understanding of sovereignty and to look at sovereignty as a malleable formation. The point that we're trying to make is that our intervention is not just about gender, it is also about our understanding of the state and the process of state formation.
Exactly. Very true. Very true. Let us have the next question, please. The next question is by Mr. Dr. Ali Haider. Can you give information about the political influence of Badshah Begum, Malikuz Zamani, who was the wife of Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah Rangila and was called a Dowager Empress? Did she remain Badshah Begum from 1721 to 1789 till her death? Also tell us about the Petticoat government or regency of Mahamanaga, the foster mother of Akbar. They are two entirely different questions. Who would take it up?
Of course, Seher.
Yeah.
So yes, Badshah Begum was also called Malika Zamani. She was a dowager empress. Uh, Actually, she was a dowager empress as the right of a queen mother, more as a wife of Muhammad Shah Rangila. So it is, and that's one of my arguments. It's in this period it was more fruitful and more. You were more politically visible as a queen mother than you were visible as a queen consort. So, only when Ahmed, as a foster mother to Ahmed Shah, we hear a lot about her in the sources, and she exercised a lot of political influence. She was of Mughal lineage. So she shared Mughal lineage as well as Mughal authorities. So she contributed in the factional politics of the period. She got head on in confrontation with other imperial women of the period. And to tell you about the Petticoat government or regency of Mahamanga as the foster mother of Akbar. So I don't think so. It can be called the Petticoat government or a regency. She was a foster mother, but she wasn't legally authorized to rule in the name of the emperor. I mean, she as a foster mother, and that's where we first learn about fosterage. She was given high deference, and she enjoyed a lot of influence, but it was censured by her attachment to Akbar, and that's the interdependent relationship. It in her own right, she was powerful to an extent, but she had to be related or associated with the ruler, both Badshah Begum or Mahamanga, both of them. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Seher. Rightly answered. Let us pass on to the next question, please. Shamoon Ahmed. Well, this is his, comment. Let us have a question, please. Shagufta, let us have the question. Did the Timurid ancestry of Mughals played any role in the political influence of Mughal women? For example, Gauhar Shah, the wife of Shah Rukh Mirza, exerted great political power. And in later Mughal period, which Mughal women exerted the most political influence? Again, sir.
So the Timurid ancestry of Mughals played an important role. Mughals, to begin with, they guarded the purity of the genealogy very zealously. It was women of high birth, women with Timurid ancestry were written off, were spoken of with in high regard, and and similarly they were given they had a certain agency, political and social agency in the Mughal court culture and the Mughal social culture as well. In the later Mughal period, interestingly, in the later Mughal period, that changes. Now, the access to power did not rely on your lineage, which did not rely solely on your lineage. Women from relatively socially inferior background or humble beginnings could also gain access to authority and be a legitimate source of imperial sovereignty. So that's a departure from the early Mughals. And I've spoken of a lot of women from humble beginnings, such as Uddam Begum, Uddam Bai. She has humble beginnings, but she rose to greater power. And similarly, there was Maryam Zamani of that time, Malika Zamani, and several other women as well. But it not necessarily relied on their on the lineage. It was more about their proximity to the emperor, the loyalty to the emperor, the purity of genealogy as a concept seemed to have frayed by the end of the later Mughal periods.
Would you like to add something, Professor Farhat Hassan?
Yes. You see, actually, it's an important question, and that's why I wanted to intervene. Because the Timurid ancestry or Timurid heritage was actually a significant element in shaping gender relations in Mughal India. Uh, and the reason for this is because, in the Timurid dispensation, let's not forget that the Timurid clan came from socially inferior background, and therefore for them to lay claims to throne, they had matrimonial alliances with the Changezid clan, which was ritually superior, and therefore there was always this inbuilt hierarchy in relationship in the in the Timurid political dispensation, which gave considerable agency to women. And this had then become a part of the heritage that was taken up by the Mughals. So that the influence of the Timurid heritage played a crucial role in shaping gender relations in Mughal India.
Right. So then, naturally, we have a lot of examples from the Babarnama itself about the political role that the women were playing even before Babar had entered into Hindustan. And not that, as Farhat pointed out, that Amir Taimur took up the title of Durgan, the son-in-law of Changiz Khan, to rule. So there was much importance which was given, even among the Changezid Mongol traditions. The mother figure or the female figure was not that important as we tend to imagine. I mean, the whole concept of Changiz as the son of God rests on the myth of Alan Quwa, which again is a mother-centric, tale through which the origins of Mongol became. So, in fact, the Timurids, who claimed their descent both from Temur and from Genghis Khan, in both the traditions, I would like to submit that the position of women was quite strong, and the Mughals, when they came to India, they were deriving their positions from both these traditions. Zainab has a question. Thanks for choosing this theme Team Ganga Jamni. My question is to Professor Farhat Hassan. Why is the account of Gulbadan Begum for Humayun's reign treated as a minor account? Is it discredited because of the gender of the writer or because it is a source from within the royal household? Similar concern has been raised by Ruby Lal in one of her papers. If sir would like to comment on the same.
Um, Yeah, I mean you're right. I mean it could be because of both. It is discredited because the gender of the writer, for sure, and also because it's seen to be a source from within the royal household and therefore not very reliable. But a more more important issue concerns emerges from our understanding of the political culture in early Mughal India. You see, if you have a view of the state which is typically institutional, which is typically structural, and you look at the state as constituted and exhausted by by stories of military expeditions, taxation, Mansab and Jahangir, then an account of Gulbadan Begum becomes entirely irrelevant. And that's one reason why this has not been seriously studied by historians, because historians for have considered Mughal state to be constituted, and to be exhausted by issues such as conquest, warfare, fiscalism, so on and so forth, Mansab and Jahangir. Now, in none of these domains, women figure in any significant capacity. It is only when we have a very different perception of the state, when we look at the state as a malleable, fluid formation in constant engagement with the social forces, that the account of Gulbadan Begum becomes extremely important. You see, and that's the reason. And she is now becoming an important source only because we have begun to look at the state in a very different framework now. Thank you.
Uh, Next question, please. Uh, is there a next question? Do we have some other comments? Uh, uh, well, this is just a comment. Wishing all of you the best. So, I mean, I would like to add a little to what Farhat Saab said. I mean, I have also dealt with a source like Gulbadan Bano Begum while I was doing my research. And why I would take it to be a minor source as one of the reasons naturally is what Farhat said. But more than that, it survives in a very fragmentary form. It only has limited pages which survive. So possibly one reason why it has also not been used properly by all the historians is that it contains information only for a limited period of time dating back to Humayun's reign. The account which she might have written about Akbar's reign is all missing from there. And as Farhat pointed out, that she is giving you a picture from within the household. So that is the strength of this Gulbadan Banu Begum account as well, because there's hardly any other such source available which gives us information about the family matters of the Mughals, which Gulbadan Bano Begum is sometimes giving us. For example, the names of aunts and cousins and sisters and so on and so forth, all type of women. Gulbadan, being a member of the family, can divulge their names, they can discuss them, but the other authors of the Mughal period naturally they do not have access to that type of information. And as Farhat said, that lately after Rubilal and others who have started working, the work of Gulbadan Bano Begum is now gaining importance, and we hope that many more researches would be done in this. Let me thank all of you, especially Professor Farhat Hassan, who was quite reluctant to join here today. He always remains quite busy, but my you know mm, It was on one point that we asked him. Incidentally, Farhat Hassan Saab also remains surrounded by women in the family. He is also the only male surrounded by two daughters and a wife. I too belong to a family who is surrounded all around with women. Well, it was a very nice discussion which took place. There were two topics, major topics, which were brought under discussion. The mother figure in the royal imperial household and the concubines. These two were the themes which were discussed. And as rightly pointed out by Dr. Khanna and by Professor Farhat Hassan, that concubines, the study of concubines in a way is a study of the common women of the Mughal Empire as well, of the 17th century. You are getting away from the imperial family. But I would tend to say that, after all, concubines are also those who are related with the ruling elites. So, in a way, they also belong to a class which is not of commons. I wish that we could have had discussion on two other groups. One, women who had nothing to do with the Mughal elites, the common women, and I feel that there is much information which is available on them. It is there in the written sources as well as surfeit of information on them through Mughal miniatures. They throw much light on the women shopkeepers. For example, we have paintings where women shopkeepers have been depicted. We have paintings where women laborers have been depicted. We have women who are running the kahwa khanas. I mean these type of establishments which are selling products. We have women who are running the sarais and so on and so forth. So there is, and of course there is much information in the paintings about the women working in the agricultural fields and so on and so forth. So I wish that at some point of time we would be able to stress more on the common women rather than those who are related with the court. So I find hardly any difference between Jahanara Begum and a woman who was a concubine of one of the princes or the emperors. So possibly in some later discussions, we would take them into it. Secondly, I would like to point out that when these recent works have been done by people like Francesca Orsini, by Ruby Lal, and others, there are three type of women which have been seen. Generally speaking, the mother, which was discussed today, the concubine, which was discussed today, but along with that, we also have the women who are known as wives. Uh, uh, I think that category, who are not concubines and not mothers, that category should also be brought into discussion. And after all, there were quite a few public women during the 17th, 18th centuries. In fact, I would only refer to the sources of Shah Jahanabad, for example, the account of Dargah Quli Khan, where these women are shown visiting dargahs. They are shown visiting all type of establishments. I mean, taking part in religious activities, taking part in musical stories, and so on and so forth. So I wish that these women should also be remembered on Women's Day. It is not only the imperial women, but those who really toiled hard, who brought food to their husbands toiling on the land, those who lifted weights on their heads and took the material to the building site. There are paintings where the hathi pole is being built and there are women laborers who are providing the material. So those women should also be remembered today, which is after all a Women's Day, not an Imperial Women's Day. With these words, I would say that let sometime Seher, sometimes Priyanka, you people would also pay attention to those neglected women who actually are hidden from sight and have yet to be revealed, although there is much material which is available on them. I once again thank every one of you who are present here for a beautiful discussion. I wish this could carry on, but then we have crossed around more than 1.5 hours in this discussion. Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you, Seher. We lost you in between. There were moments when we did have you, but we could not actually hear what you were saying. Farhat Hassan Sahab, your supervisor, was quite, nice enough to sum up. I don't know whether you were actually saying that or not, but Farhat, with your mouth. Thank you, Farhat. And once, thank you and good night to all of you.
Good night,
Goodbye.
everyone. Thank you,
Thank
ladies, for
you.
being with us. Thank you, Professor Hassan. Good night, Professor Razavi.
Good night.